Put together supply and demand in our framework and look for the outcomes that we can expect with a few examples. I've listed here on my whiteboard are 9 determinants, the way I have them the way I compartmentalize them. And what we're going to do is look at events that might happen and apply these and check the outcomes. So the first step is to set up our framework. So in this space, I'm going to put together our framework. Price quantity, supply is upward sloping, demand is downward sloping. And now what we have happening here, where these two intersect, we have this very special place called equilibrium. I use a little asterisk to describe equilibrium. And what that means is at that price and only that price, the quantity supplied is just equal to the quantity demanded. The amount that the sellers are willing and able to sell at that price is equal to the same amount that the consumers are willing and able to purchase at that price. Before I shift anything, let's show why we expect that to be so. Everyone's heard the term, or terms like this anyway, price gouging. Now the idea here of this term, we've heard it a lot. I've heard it a lot with the around masks and things like that with the event that we've been going through. So I think it's a pretty commonly used term, and the idea of price gouging, if we were to incorporate that into our model, would be that the sellers are charging a price that is somehow like too high, right? We might say it's unfair, but let's suppose instead of just saying it's unfair, we say it's too high in the sense of it's above what the market can bear. Well, if that were the case, maybe that would be like here, right? That's higher than the market price or the equilibrium price. Now, at that price, think of supply and demand as separate animals, right? Just think of them by themselves. Don't just think of them as this X. But at that price, consumers are willing and able to purchase this much. This is the quantity demanded. Well, at that higher price, of course, higher prices mean sellers are willing and able to sell more. So that higher price, this is the quantity supplied. So we have the quantity supplied rising to go clear out here and the quantity demanded falling to go way in here. So what we have is a case of excess supply. Now sometimes this is called a surplus. I don't really like to call this a surplus at this time because in this market things can adjust the way we have it here. And later we'll discuss when things can't adjust, but there's no reason to expect this to stay because excess supply. Let's think about what that would look like. It's piling up on the shelves. The sellers are making more of it than the consumers are buying at that high price. So it's just piling up. Well, if you see stuff piling up on the shelves at a retail outlet, many people watching have worked retail, I've worked retail, when things are just piling up on the shelf and piling up in the warehouse and more is coming in and it's not going out the door in the form of consumers buying it, what do you suppose sellers are tempted to do to get it out of there? They put it on sale, right? They lower the price. Let's suppose they go too far. They get just wild and crazy and they lower the price below V star. So let's say, let me try to pick a place where I can fit things in. Let's say they lower the price to here. Well, at that price, now the sellers are willing and able to produce and sell this much. I'm just out of space, so I'm writing way down here. The quantity supplied falls down here, right? That's this. I just had it written down here to fit it in. And the consumers at that lower price, of course, are willing and able to buy more. So the quantity demanded is here. And now we have a case of excess demand. So now it's flying off the shelf. The shelf is empty, and people are waiting there for it to come in on the truck. So that when it's hauled out to the shelf from the warehouse, they're like right there, and boom, they're taking it to the register and they're checking out the stuff. They're buying it. Well, if you're a seller and you see that people are willing to wait for something, you might start to think, well, if they're willing to wait for it, they're willing to pay a little bit more for it, aren't they? And so if you're the seller, what are you tempted to do? Raise that price. So where's our best guess at where a price should be at any given time? Right there. Because these sort of natural forces pressure the price to move to the quantity supplied equaling the quantity demanded because of the excess supply or excess demand that we could expect when we deviate from that. So that's why we expect to be at equilibrium. Of course, we could be, depending on the volatility of the market, like stock, shares of stock, very volatile. We could be bouncing around equilibrium all the time. Or if we're talking about a lot of the things that you and I buy, those equilibrium prices are not very volatile at all. It just depends, like so many things we talk about. But our best guess at where a market would be is at equilibrium because the forces pressure it to that place. So now let's talk about some hypothetical examples, things that might happen. Let's suppose for a second we're talking about any good that is shipped, like, or I changed my mind. I had this in mind. Let's talk about flights on planes. Notwithstanding everything we're going through with the coronavirus and the safety things around planes, let's talk about before this happened, just for simplicity. These are, I'm saying, ticks for tickets for flights. So there are consumers for flights. It could be recreational or business travel. The airlines are the sellers of flights. There's an equilibrium price for your standard seat on an airplane for some destination or given miles. Really, it's a destination. Now let's suppose that oil prices come down and jet fuel prices correspondingly come down. First thing we did was I set up the framework with nothing happening. Okay, so that's what you want to do. That's your first step. I like to think of things in steps. Okay, so set it up. Demand is downward sloping, supply is upward sloping. Your vertical label is price, your horizontal label is quantity, and you're sitting at equilibrium and before anything has happened. Now, something is always going to happen. That's what these problems are about. Now, we have our 9 determinants of supply and demand listed here. And I like to list how many things are in a list beside it, so that way I know when I'm trying to memorize something how many to look for, because I was a tenacious student and I would list determinants of demand and make myself remember what they were. So I would list them on a sheet of paper over and over until I had them memorized. So perhaps you want to do that. You're looking for 5 of these and 4 of these, at least the way I have them. Our textbook has them slightly different. That's okay. Pick a way and go with it. It will work. All right. So what I've said is the price of airline fuel has come down, and we're interested in flights or seats on the plane, tickets for flights. Of our 9 determinants, what does airplane fuel sound like? Don't read into it too much. Just straight up, airplane fuel in terms of the production of airplane of tickets or flights to ride on an airplane. That's input prices. Because flying those seats across the country or to a destination, an input to getting people going where they're going when they buy tickets is that airline fuel, right? So cheaper airline fuel, that's a lower input price. That means for any price the sellers can get, they're willing to sell more tickets or able to sell more tickets. And so we're talking about an increase in supply. So first step, draw your framework. Second step, identify the determinants. Third step, what we just did there was ask ourselves, which way is it going to move which curve? It's going to be supply, it's going to increase supply. Fourth step then, draw it in. But I'm not done. That is an increase in supply. Some people might be looking at this going, it's a decrease in supply. Watch the most recent video. You're falling for a Jedi mind trick. That is an increase in supply because fuel is cheaper. Sellers are willing and able to sell more seats or tickets at all price levels. Now the last step, and this is key, and it breaks my heart when students don't do this, is to go back and look at the outcomes. The whole reason to do this is to see what it does to price and quantity, so don't forget to identify what it's going to do to the price and quantity of the seats or the tickets. The new equilibrium is here. That's going to push down on the price of flights or tickets to ride on a plane. More tickets, thus, will be bought and sold. And that's it. Sometimes a common mistake that's made is that students will say, well, if it's cheaper, people will buy more, so they increase demand. No, don't do that. These are the things that shift demand. Price is not one of them. Go back to the beginning. Remember, changes in price change the quantity demanded. That's what our curve did to us and showed us. The quantity demanded did rise. It's right here. It's going right along there. That's our change in, quote unquote, change in demand, is the change in the quantity demanded, because now the flights are cheaper because the sellers can sell them for less. So you're done once you've identified these. A common mistake, I hope that's clear because now I'm going to mess this up. A common mistake is for students to go, oh, cheaper prices raises demand. And then they increase demand. I've seen this. They raise demand. And then they go, okay, well now the price is up. And then they go, well, higher prices, not only do consumers want to buy less, sellers want to sell more at higher prices. So then they draw in another increase in supply. And then they go, well, now the price is back down. And then they go, well, I don't know what they say, honestly. Let me go ahead and, at lower prices, consumers would purchase more again. So they do like something like this. And eventually they just keep on going and going and going until they say, well, I must have answered it somewhere. And they just stop. So I call this a cobweb because that's what it looks like. It's a bunch of spiders, threads to a cobweb. No. With our questions, we're going to have an event, and we're going to have a shift. And we're going to have a change in price and a change in quantity in the market that we're analyzing. And that's it, and that's all. Don't get carried away. Don't overthink it. So let's go through another example. And what I did on this other laptop here in front of me was pulled up some news. I pulled up two news sources that I like, although one of them I haven't looked at for years, but CNBC is the first one I'm looking at here. I look at it pretty much every day. Here's a headline in CNBC. ESPN's Week 1 Monday Night Football ratings fall nearly 11%. ESPN's Week 1 I can't read today. ESPN's Week 1 Monday Night Football ratings fall nearly 11%. I like Tostitos. I like Tostitos products. I like their salsa, and I like the chips. Particularly, my favorite is the lime chips, although occasionally I do like the touch of jalapeno chips. They're delightful. My wife likes the plain, original Tostitos. So, I'm going to look at Tostitos. I'm referring to any of the chips, and I'm setting up my framework. And it doesn't have to be super neat to get what we need out of it, because we're looking for the outcomes on price and quantity. So for setting up my framework, I have my equilibrium price and my equilibrium quantity. Football ratings are falling. Why am I interested in Tostitos related to football? What does football, Monday Night Football viewing, have to do with Tostitos? What could you guess that I'm getting at? Is there a relationship between Tostitos and NFL football? Yes, indeed, there is. Tostitos actually hosts a college football game called the Tostitos Bowl because there's such a relationship between football and Tostitos. They are related goods. They are complements. When people watch football, they like to munch on something, and a popular thing is Tostitos. So if people aren't watching as much football, what should that tell me about Tostitos? Is there anything going on in that market? Right? I've drawn my framework. I've asked myself, what are the 9 determinants does it sound like? Now I'm asking, which curve, well, it's under demand, so it's going to be demand. Is it going to increase or decrease demand for Tostitos if people are watching less television football? I suspect it's going to decrease demand for Tostitos. This is actually bad news for that company. They make chips, but what's happening in the world of football is affecting this chip maker. So that's going to decrease demand for Tostitos. So I draw it in, Now I trace it back to the axes. There will be fewer Tostitos bought and sold. The quantity supplied will fall because they can't get as much for them. Now, as a consumer of Tostitos and one who doesn't really watch a lot of football, this is actually a pretty good news for me. I'm suspecting I'll see my lime chips on sale. And I like that. See, it pushes down on the price and down on the quantity. It's not good for the people who make Tostitos for a living, is it? Because what they do isn't going to be as necessary. So that's how we can analyze these things and see how they affect us. One more that I thought would be kind of interesting. I went to The Economist. I'm at theeconomist.com. I used to subscribe to this. I don't anymore. It's based in England, so sometimes you can get some different news here a little bit. You hear things you don't hear as often over here on news. I thought this was maybe a little interesting. Ports are highly exposed to climate change and often ill-prepared. Ports, as in the places where ships pull in, they're saying might be in trouble because they're not updating and preparing for rising sea change, or sea level rise, they say. So let's look at railroad shipping. And I'm drawing the framework. It's my first step. P up there, Q down there, supply upward sloping, demand downward sloping. There's an equilibrium price. This would be per ton per mile of shipping goods via railroad. What's the relationship between railroad shipping and ports? Well, ports are serviced by railroads with international product, although domestic product could be shipped up and down the East Coast or up and down the West Coast or the Gulf in the case of the U.S. But if the ports aren't working well, or if there's problems at the ports, I don't know. I think the relationship between shipping and ports could be complements because railroad cars do go to ports, but they could also be substitutes. So I'm thinking that effect is probably fairly strong, that if the ports were somehow inadequate for shipping to work, that would be good news for the railroad industry because they're substitutes, and ports are now more costly to use because the ships can't get in there or they're falling apart. And so that could arguably, okay, I'm using real life today's headline, so it's not going to fit perfectly. It's just a guess here, something we might expect. An educated guess, that could raise demand for shipping, by railroad. So I draw it in, trace it back to the axes. We could see upward pressure on the price of railroad shipping and more goods being shipped by railroad because they're not being shipped in ships, which would be good for the workers in the railroad industry. But for people who always use the railroads, this is kind of bad news because now some of the supply chain managers who used to use shipping are going to shift over to railroads because of the problem with the ports. So those are a few examples and the steps that I like to use to solve these problems. Please remember to go all the way back to the changes in price and quantity that we should expect, because that is really why we're going through this exercise.